They tied both her arms for a knife drop as punishment for allegedly poisoning 3 settler children, but when the Comanche chief's son broke the ropes and declared her under tribal protection, he unknowingly saved the one woman who held the cure to the plague that would soon devastate both their peoples. Montana Territory, September 1876. The morning sun cast long shadows across Willow Creek settlement, but no birds sang in the cottonwood trees, no children played in the dusty streets, and no smoke rose from the bakery chimney. The silence that gripped the frontier town was not peaceful, but deadly, the kind that comes when death walks among the living and no one knows who it will claim next. At the center of the settlement's main square stood a wooden platform, hastily constructed 3 days prior, its rough-hewn planks still bleeding sap in the autumn heat. Above it hung a contraption that chilled the blood of even the hardest frontiersman. 2 thick ropes stretched taut between posts, designed to suspend a person by their wrists while knives were thrown with deadly precision around their body. Missing by mere inches, a punishment reserved for those crimes so heinous that hanging seemed too merciful. The crowd that gathered was unlike any Willow Creek had seen before. Settlers, trappers, miners, and cavalry soldiers formed an angry sea of faces, their eyes burning with grief and rage. But what made this gathering truly extraordinary was the presence of the Comanche war band that sat their painted ponies along the settlement's eastern edge. 30 warriors in full regalia, their faces painted for war, watching the proceedings with the intensity of predators studying prey. Among them sat Storm Greywolf, 24 years old and son of Chief Thunderhawk, his lean frame draped in the traditional buckskin of his people, decorated with eagle feathers that marked his status as a proven warrior. His dark eyes scanned the crowd below with curiosity rather than hostility, for he had ridden here not for war, but seeking answers to questions that had been plaguing his own people for weeks. The same mysterious sickness that had begun claiming lives in his village had apparently reached the white settlement first. The woman who stood bound to the platform looked nothing like the monster the crowd believed her to be. Abigail "Abby" Westbrook appeared fragile in her torn blue calico dress, her auburn hair hanging loose around shoulders that trembled not from fear but from exhaustion. Dark circles shadowed her green eyes, and her once soft hands bore the calluses and cuts of someone who had spent recent weeks desperately gathering herbs and mixing medicines in a futile attempt to save lives. But the crowd saw only a poisoner, a witch, a woman whose very presence in their town had coincided with the arrival of death itself. Sheriff Jonas Mitchell stepped forward, his weathered face grim as granite. He had been reluctant to proceed with this medieval form of justice, but the town council and the grieving families had demanded satisfaction. And in a frontier settlement where the nearest federal law was 300 miles away, the will of the people often became the only law that mattered. In his hand, he held a folded paper, the formal charges that would justify what many in the crowd secretly knew was nothing more than a lynching dressed up in legal ceremony. Citizens of Willow Creek, Mitchell's voice carried across the square, rough and weary, we are gathered here to carry out the sentence decreed by the town council for the crimes committed against our community. Abigail Westbrook stands accused of the willful poisoning of 3 children, Sarah Miller, age 7, Thomas Henderson, age 9, and little Mary Collins, age 5, all of whom died in agony after consuming medicines provided by the accused. A woman in the crowd screamed, "She killed my baby," and several men surged forward before being restrained by others. The grief was real, the pain unbearable, but Storm Greywolf had seen enough human suffering to recognize the difference between justice and vengeance, and what he witnessed below was clearly the latter. Mitchell continued, his voice growing stronger as he fed off the crowd's energy. Furthermore, she stands accused of practicing witchcraft, of consorting with dark spirits, and of bringing a curse upon our settlement. that has claimed 7 additional lives in the past week. The evidence against her is overwhelming, witnessed by multiple citizens, confirmed by the town doctor, and supported by the unnatural circumstances surrounding each death. From her position on the platform, Abby raised her head for the first time since being dragged from her cell. Her voice was weak but clear as mountain water. "I never harmed those children. I tried to save them. The sickness was already in them when their parents brought them to me. I gave them everything I knew to give, every herb, every remedy my grandmother taught me, but it wasn't enough." Her words were drowned out by angry shouts and curses. The crowd had no interest in hearing her defense. They wanted blood. They wanted someone to blame for the incomprehensible tragedy that had befallen their community. And Abby Westbrook, with her strange knowledge of herbs and her solitary ways, made a perfect scapegoat. But Storm Greywolf leaned forward on his horse, his attention fully captured by something the white settlers had missed, the way she spoke of herbs and remedies, the mention of knowledge passed down from her grandmother. These were not the words of a poisoner, but of a healer, someone who understood the old ways of medicine that his own people had practiced for generations. Yosit Mitchell unfolded a second paper, this one bearing the official seal of the territorial government, though Storm suspected it was either forged or obtained through lies. "By the authority vested in me by the Montana Territory and the emergency, powers granted during times of plague and civil unrest, I hereby sentence Abigail Westbrook to death by knife drop, to be carried out immediately. May God have mercy on her soul, for this community shall have none." The executioner stepped forward. A grizzled mountain man named Black Pete Morrison, who was known throughout the territory for his skill with throwing knives. He carried a leather pouch containing 6 perfectly balanced blades, each one honed to razor sharpness. The knife drop was a cruel spectacle that had originated in the goldfields of California, where claim jumpers and horse thieves were subjected to this particular form of frontier justice. The victim would be suspended by their wrists while knives were thrown in a predetermined pattern around their body, starting far from vital areas and gradually moving closer with each throw. Death usually came from blood loss, as the blades found their mark, though occasionally a victim would die from shock or heart failure before the knives completed their deadly dance. As Morrison began examining his weapons with professional interest, checking their balance and testing their edges against his thumb, Abby closed her eyes and whispered what sounded like a prayer. But Storm's keen hearing caught words that made his blood run cold. She was not praying to the Christian God, but speaking in a dialect he recognized, a mixture of Cheyenne and Crow phrases that his grandmother had taught him, words used in the ancient healing ceremonies of the Plains tribes. The first rope was tied around Abby's left wrist, the coarse hemp cutting into her skin as 2 men hoisted her arm above her head. She bit her lip to keep from crying out, determined not to give the crowd the satisfaction of seeing her break. But when they reached for her right arm, something unexpected happened. A young boy pushed through the crowd, no more than 10 years old, with tears streaming down his dirt-stained face. "Wait!" the child screamed, his voice cracking with emotion. "Please wait. She didn't poison nobody. She tried to help my ma when she got sick. She gave her medicine that made the fever go down. Ma said Miss Abby was an angel. She said the sickness wasn't Miss Abby's fault." The boy's mother, a gaunt woman in a faded dress, rushed forward to pull her son away, her face flushed with embarrassment and fear. "Tommy, no, you don't understand. Come away from there. Come away right now." But the damage was done. The child's innocent testimony had planted a seed of doubt in minds that had been certain of Abby's guilt. Murmurs rippled through the crowd as people began to remember their own interactions with the accused woman. How she had always been quick to help when someone was injured, how she had never asked for payment when she tended to cuts and bruises, how she had sat up all night with old Mrs. Patterson when the pneumonia nearly took her last winter. Sheriff Mitchell's jaw clenched as he realized the crowd's bloodlust was beginning to waver. He had seen lynch mobs turn on themselves when doubt crept in, and he was determined not to let that happen here. "The boy is confused by grief," announced loudly. "Children don't understand the subtle ways that poison can be administered. The accused woman has clearly bewitched this family as she has others. This only proves how dangerous she truly is." The second rope was secured around Abby's right wrist despite her increasingly desperate struggles. Her feet barely touched the platform as she was hoisted into position, her arms stretched painfully wide. The position was designed to make the victim an easy target while maximizing their suffering. And as Black Pete Morrison selected his first knife, testing its weight with the casual expertise of a craftsman, the crowd fell silent in anticipation of the coming spectacle. But Storm Greywolf had heard enough, and more importantly, he had remembered something crucial. 3 weeks ago, his own sister had fallen ill with the same symptoms described by these white settlers: fever, convulsions, and a strange rash that spread across the skin like fire. The tribal medicine man had been powerless to help her, and she had died in agony while Storm held her hand and promised to find answers. If this white woman truly possessed knowledge of healing herbs, if she was indeed innocent of the crimes attributed to her, then she might hold the key to saving other members of his tribe who were still fighting the mysterious sickness. He urged his horse forward, breaking from the Comanche formation and riding slowly toward the platform. His movement was deliberate and controlled, designed to avoid triggering a panic or a fight. But every eye in the settlement turned toward him as he approached, hands moving instinctively toward weapons, mothers clutching their children closer, men forming protective clusters around their families. Storm raised his right hand in the universal sign of peaceful intent. His voice carried clearly across the square as he spoke in accented but fluent English. "I would speak with your chief about this woman." Sheriff Mitchell's hand dropped to his gun butt, though he was careful not to draw the weapon. "This is none of your concern, Comanche. This woman has committed crimes against our people. Justice will be done according to our laws." "Your laws," Storm replied, his tone respectful but firm. "But this woman speaks the old words, the healing words of my grandmother's people. If she is truly a poisoner, then why does she know the sacred phrases used to drive away sickness and death?" The crowd stirred uneasily at this revelation. Many had heard the strange words Abby had whispered, but none had understood their significance. The idea that she might possess knowledge of Indian medicine was both fascinating and terrifying to people who had been taught to view all native practices as savage superstition. Morrison hefted his first knife, eager to begin his grisly work. Before this interruption could go any further, "Sheriff, we gonna stand here jawing with hostiles all day, or are we gonna give this witch what she deserves?" But Storm was not finished. He had noticed something else that the settlers had missed in their rage and grief. Abby's fingers, despite being bound and stretched painfully wide, were moving in a subtle pattern, tracing symbols in the air that he recognized from his childhood. His grandmother had used the same gestures when preparing medicine bundles, the same precise movements that were said to call upon the spirits of healing plants to lend their power to the healer's work. "This woman is no poisoner," Storm declared, his voice growing stronger and more commanding, drawing on the authority that came from being the son of a chief. "She is a medicine woman, a keeper of the old knowledge. You would kill someone who could save your people from the sickness that even now spreads through your settlement like wildfire." To emphasize his point, Storm gestured toward the settlement's outskirts, where several houses displayed the traditional markers of illness, yellow cloths tied to porch posts to warn visitors away, the same markers that had appeared on 3 more homes just that morning, proving that whatever had killed the children was far from finished with Willow Creek. Sheriff Mitchell's face flushed red with anger and embarrassment. He had not expected to be challenged by an Indian in front of his own people, and certainly not to have that challenge expose the weakness of his position. Even if what you say is true, even if she has some knowledge of Indian medicine, that doesn't change the fact that children died after taking her treatments. Children die, Storm replied with the blunt honesty of someone who had seen too much death in his young life. The sickness that took them is ancient and powerful. Older than your settlement, older than my tribe's time in this valley. It has killed warriors and chiefs, medicine men and shamans, white children and Indian children alike, but this woman fought against it. She did not cause it. As if summoned by his words, a commotion erupted at the edge of the crowd. Dr. Harrison Webb, the settlement's only physician, came running toward the platform, his medical bag bouncing against his hip. His usually neat appearance, disheveled from days of fighting a losing battle against the spreading epidemic. "Sheriff Mitchell," he called out, gasping for breath. "You have to stop this. I've just received word from Fort Kellogg. The same sickness has appeared there, and at 3 other settlements along the Yellowstone River. This isn't something that one woman could have caused. It's a plague, a natural epidemic." The doctor's words hit the crowd like a physical blow. Suddenly their certainty about Abby's guilt began to crumble. If the sickness was spreading to places she had never visited, then how could she be responsible for its appearance in Willow Creek? Murmurs of doubt grew louder, and several people near the back of the crowd began to drift away, uncomfortable, with their role in what was beginning to look like a terrible mistake. But Morrison had been drinking steadily since dawn, preparing himself for the gruesome task ahead, and he was in no mood to be cheated of his moment in the spotlight. "Don't matter what some army sawbones says," he slurred, brandishing his knife. "This witch brought evil to our town, and by God, she's going to pay for it." He drew back his arm to make the first throw, aiming for the space just inches from Abby's left shoulder. But Storm Greywolf had seen enough. In one fluid motion, he swung down from his horse and sprinted toward the platform, his moccasin-clad feet silent on the hard-packed earth, covering the distance faster than anyone thought possible. Morrison released his knife just as Storm reached the platform, the blade spinning end over end through the morning air toward its helpless target. But the young Comanche warrior's reflexes were honed by years of hunting and warfare. He leaped upward, his hand closing around the knife's handle mere inches from Abby's trembling flesh. The crowd gasped in amazement and fear as Storm landed gracefully on the platform, the captured blade gleaming in his grip. "Enough," he said, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of a born leader. "This woman is under the protection of the Comanche nation. Any who would harm her must first face the son of Thunderhawk." The declaration sent shockwaves through the assembled crowd. To claim protection over a white settler was unprecedented. To do so in defiance of frontier justice was tantamount to a declaration of war. But Storm Greywolf stood firm, his dark eyes blazing with determination as he used Morrison's own knife to cut the ropes binding Abby's wrists. She collapsed too, her knees as the circulation returned to her arms, gasping with relief and pain. But she managed to look up at her unexpected savior with gratitude shining in her green eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the crowd's growing rumble of anger and confusion. Storm knelt beside her, his voice low and urgent. "Can you ride, medicine woman? My people have need of your knowledge, and this place is no longer safe for either of us." The moment Storm Greywolf's knife severed the last rope, chaos erupted. Across Willow Creek settlement like a flash flood breaking through a dam, Sheriff Mitchell's hand flew to his Colt .45, but the 30 Comanche warriors who had been watching from the eastern ridge suddenly appeared much closer, their painted ponies having moved with the silent efficiency of hunting wolves while all eyes were focused on the platform. The metallic click of rifle hammers being pulled back echoed from multiple directions as both sides prepared for a bloodbath that would leave the dusty streets soaked in red. Black Pete Morrison, his face purple with rage and whiskey, lunged forward with another knife gleaming in his fist. But Storm was already moving, his years of training in Comanche warfare making him a blur of controlled violence. He caught Morrison's wrist in a grip that could crush bones, twisted sharply until the mountain man screamed and dropped his weapon, then delivered a precise blow to his throat that sent him crashing to his knees, gasping for air like a landed fish. "Back away from the platform," Storm commanded in English, then repeated the order in his native tongue for his warriors. His voice carried the absolute authority of someone born to lead men in battle. But underneath the steel was something else, a desperate urgency that spoke of stakes far higher than personal honor or tribal pride. "This woman comes with me. Any who try to stop us will answer to Thunderhawk himself." Dr. Webb pushed through the crowd, his medical training overriding his fear as he approached the platform with his hands raised peacefully. "Wait, please. If what you say is true, if she truly has knowledge that could help fight this plague, then we need to work together, not spill blood over misunderstandings and prejudice." The doctor's words hung in the air like smoke from a peace pipe, offering a path away from violence that no one wanted, but everyone seemed destined to embrace. Storm studied the older man's face, noting the exhaustion etched in every line, the desperate hope flickering in his eyes. This was a healer who had watched too many patients die despite his best efforts, someone who would grasp at any chance to save lives regardless of where that chance originated. Abby struggled to her feet on the platform, her legs shaking from the ordeal, but her mind sharp with the clarity that comes from surviving near death. She had heard Storm's words about his people needing her knowledge, and she understood the implications better than anyone in the crowd. The sickness that had claimed the children of Willow Creek was indeed ancient, a plague that her grandmother had called the Red Death for the distinctive rash it left on its victims. And if it was spreading among the Comanche, then time was running out for more than just frontier settlements. "Dr. Webb is right," she said, her voice stronger now despite her ordeal. "This sickness, it's not something I caused. It's something I've been fighting my whole life. My grandmother was part Cherokee. She taught me the old ways of recognizing and treating diseases that white medicine doesn't understand. What's happening here will only get worse unless we find a way to stop it." Her revelation sent another shockwave through the crowd. The idea that their supposed poisoner was actually part Indian explained much about her unusual knowledge and methods, but it also raised new questions about why she had chosen to live among white settlers rather than with her own people. Sheriff Mitchell seized on this detail like a drowning man grabbing driftwood, desperate to maintain some semblance of control over a situation that was rapidly spiraling beyond his authority. "So you admit it," he shouted, his voice cracking with strain. "You're a half-breed spy, sent here to weaken our defenses with your savage witchcraft. You've probably been poisoning our wells and our food supplies for months, preparing the way for a Comanche attack." The accusation was so absurd that several people in the crowd actually laughed, but the nervous, bitter laughter of people pushed beyond their breaking point by fear and grief. Storm Grey Wolf's expression darkened like storm clouds gathering on the horizon, his hand moving instinctively to the war club hanging at his side. The insult to Abby was also an insult to his people, and Comanche warriors did not tolerate such slights lightly. But before violence could erupt again, a new voice cut through the tension like an arrow finding its mark. "Sheriff Mitchell, stand down immediately. You are relieved of your duties pending a full investigation of this matter." Colonel James Whitmore of the 7th Cavalry emerged from the crowd, his blue uniform immaculate despite the dust and chaos surrounding him. Behind him marched 20 soldiers in full battle gear, their Spencer repeating rifles held at the ready. The colonel's arrival changed the entire dynamic of the standoff, introducing federal authority into what had been a local dispute. and his first act was to place himself squarely between the two armed factions. "I've been tracking this epidemic from Fort Kellogg," Whitmore announced, his military bearing commanding instant attention. "What started there 3 weeks ago has now spread to 7 settlements and 2 army posts. We're dealing with a full-scale medical emergency that requires cooperation, not vigilante justice. Anyone who interferes with efforts to combat this plague will be arrested and charged with obstruction of federal operations." Storm studied the colonel with the calculating gaze of a warrior assessing a potential enemy. Whitmore was younger than most officers of his rank, probably advanced quickly due to competence rather than political connections. His uniform bore the dust stains of hard riding, and his eyes held the haunted look of a man who had seen too much death in recent weeks. This was not a glory-seeking fool, but a professional soldier faced with a crisis that bullets and cavalry charges could not solve. "Colonel," Storm said, his English carefully precise, "I am Storm Greywolf, son of Chief Thunderhawk of the Northern Comanche. I claim this woman under the ancient laws of sanctuary. She possesses knowledge that my people require to fight the sickness that has already taken my sister and threatens many others." The formal declaration of sanctuary was a diplomatic masterstroke that caught everyone off guard. It invoked treaties and agreements that most frontier settlers barely understood, but that carried the weight of federal law. Whitmore's eyebrows rose slightly as he recognized the implications. To deny sanctuary claimed by a chief's son could trigger the very Indian War that his superiors in Washington were desperately trying to avoid. "And what exactly do you propose, Mr. Greywolf?" the colonel asked, using the respectful address that protocol demanded when dealing with Native American nobility. "How do you suggest we resolve this situation in a way that serves everyone's interests?" Before Storm could answer, Abby stepped forward, her voice clear and determined despite her recent ordeal. "I propose we stop wasting time arguing over whose fault this is and start working together to save lives. I've seen this plague before, in the Cherokee territories when I was a child. My grandmother helped stop it then, but it required knowledge from both white medicine and native healing traditions." Dr. Webb nodded eagerly, recognizing the wisdom in her words. "The symptoms I've observed don't match any disease in my medical texts. The fever patterns are irregular, the rash appears in configurations I've never seen, and none of the standard treatments have proven effective. If there's traditional knowledge that could help, I'm willing to learn." Colonel Whitmore glanced between the various factions, calculating odds and weighing consequences with the practiced ease of a career military officer. The crowd was beginning to disperse as people realized that federal troops and Comanche warriors were unlikely to engage in a shooting match over their heads. The immediate crisis was passing, but the larger problem remained unsolved. "Very well," he decided. "I'm declaring a temporary medical emergency collaboration. Miss Westbrook will work with Dr. Webb to develop treatments using whatever methods prove effective. Mr. Greywolf and his people will assist in gathering medicinal plants and sharing traditional knowledge, and anyone who interferes with these efforts will spend the duration of this crisis in military custody." Sheriff Mitchell's face turned an alarming shade of purple, but he had enough sense to recognize when he was outgunned. Both literally and politically, he holstered his weapon with obvious reluctance, muttering curses under his breath as he pushed through the crowd toward the saloon. Several of his supporters followed, their anger undiminished, but their options severely limited by the arrival of federal authority. Storm helped Abby down from the platform, noting how she favored her left shoulder where the rope had cut deeply into her flesh. His respect for her courage grew as he realized she had endured the ordeal without a single cry of pain or plea for mercy. This was a woman with the inner strength of a true warrior, regardless of the circumstances of her birth or upbringing. "Can you travel?" he asked quietly. "My people's camp is 2 days' ride from here, but some of our sick ones may not survive much longer without help." Abby tested her injured shoulder, wincing slightly but managing a small smile. I can ride, but first I need to gather my supplies from my cabin. The medicines I've been preparing might help your people, even if they couldn't save the children here. Dr. Webb overheard and stepped closer, his medical bag clutched tightly in his weathered hands. Miss Westbrook, I'd like to accompany you. If possible, I have supplies and instruments that might complement your traditional remedies. And frankly, I need to learn everything I can about fighting this disease before it spreads further. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The unlikely alliance was taking shape despite the chaos and violence that had preceded it. A white frontier doctor, a half-Cherokee medicine woman, and a Comanche war chief's son, united by the common enemy of disease and death. But Storm knew that the real challenges lay ahead. His people were deeply suspicious of white settlers after decades of broken treaties and betrayed trusts. Convincing them to accept help from outsiders would require all his diplomatic skills and family influence. Colonel Whitmore assigned a squad of soldiers to escort the medical party, both for protection and to ensure that the federal government maintained some oversight of the unprecedented cooperation. As the group prepared to depart, curious onlookers gathered to watch the strangest procession Willow Creek had ever witnessed. Three cultures that had been at war, now riding together toward an uncertain future. Abby's cabin sat on the outskirts of town, a modest structure that reflected her solitary lifestyle and practical nature. But inside, Storm and Dr. Webb discovered a treasure trove of medical knowledge that defied easy categorization. Dried herbs hung in carefully labeled bundles from the rafters. Glass bottles containing mysterious tinctures lined wooden shelves, and a collection of handwritten journals recorded decades of observations about diseases, treatments, and healing. The techniques, my grandmother's work, Abby explained, reverently touching one of the older journals. She spent 50 years documenting how traditional Cherokee medicine could be combined with white medical practices. Most people thought she was crazy, trying to bridge two worlds that seemed determined to destroy each other. Dr. Webb examined the journals with growing amazement, recognizing sophisticated understanding of anatomy, disease progression, and pharmacology that rivaled anything taught in Eastern medical schools. This is extraordinary work. The attention to detail, the systematic approach to testing treatments. She was conducting scientific research decades before such methods became standard. Storm watched the two healers work together, noting how quickly they fell into a natural partnership despite their different backgrounds and training. Abby's intuitive understanding of plant properties complemented Webb's technical knowledge of anatomy and physiology, while both shared the healer's fundamental drive to preserve life regardless of personal cost or risk. As they gathered supplies and prepared for the journey to the Comanche camp, Storm found himself thinking about his sister Running Deer, who had died 3 weeks earlier, despite the efforts of the tribe's most powerful medicine men. She had been only 19, beautiful and intelligent, promised in marriage to a war chief from a neighboring band. Her death had devastated not only Storm's family, but the entire tribal community. The memory of her final moments drove him to work faster, helping Abby pack her precious medicines and journals. Every minute they delayed meant another chance for the Red Death to claim more victims among his people, but he also understood that rushing into the Comanche camp without proper preparation could doom the entire mission before it began. "There's something you need to understand about my people," he told Abby as they secured the last of her supplies. "They've been betrayed by whites so many times that trust doesn't come easily. Some of the elders will see your presence as an invasion, an attempt to weaken us with foreign medicine and foreign ideas." Abby nodded solemnly, understanding the implications better than most. My grandmother faced the same suspicions from both sides. Whites who thought Indian medicine was primitive superstition, and Indians who saw white influence as cultural contamination. But sickness doesn't care about politics or prejudice. It kills everyone equally. Dr. Webb looked up from examining one of Abby's plant specimens, his expression troubled. There's another complication we haven't discussed. If this epidemic continues to spread, it could trigger panic throughout the territory. Frightened settlers might demand military action against any tribe suspected of harboring the disease. We could be looking at the start of another Indian war. The sobering reality of their situation settled over the group like a burial shroud. They were racing not only against disease and death, but against the darker angels of human nature, fear and prejudice that could transform a medical crisis into a racial conflict with consequences far beyond any individual tragedy. Storm shouldered his share of the medical supplies, his warriors' training making the heavy load seem effortless, but the weight of responsibility pressed down on him like a mountain. He was asking his people to trust their ancient enemies at their moment of greatest vulnerability, and if he was wrong about Abby's abilities or motivations, the consequences could destroy everything his father had worked to build. We ride hard and fast, he decided. Every hour we delay gives the sickness more time to spread, and gives fear more time to poison minds on both sides of this conflict. As the unlikely medical expedition prepared to depart Willow Creek, none of them could have imagined the challenges that lay ahead, or the way this desperate alliance would transform not only their own lives, but the entire relationship between their peoples. But sometimes the greatest changes begin with the smallest acts of courage, and on this day, courage had many faces. The trail north from Willow Creek wound through landscape that seemed torn between two different worlds. Rolling prairie grass giving way to rocky outcroppings where ancient spirits were said to dwell, cottonwood groves that provided shelter for both deer and war parties, and hidden valleys where the bones of buffalo herds lay bleaching under the Montana sun like monuments to a dying way of life. Storm Greywolf rode point on his paint stallion, reading the land with eyes trained from childhood to spot danger in every shadow and opportunity in every wind-carved stone. Behind him, the strangest cavalry patrol in frontier history stretched out in a column that would have amazed military historians. Dr. Harrison Webb bounced uncomfortably on an army mount, his medical bag secured behind his saddle, alongside emergency surgical instruments that he prayed would not be needed. Abigail Westbrook rode with the natural grace of someone raised in wild country, her precious medicine bundles wrapped in oiled leather and distributed among several pack horses to prevent total loss if disaster struck. And 10 blue-coated soldiers provided escort under the nervous command of Lieutenant Samuel Morrison, a West Point graduate who had never imagined his first independent command would involve negotiating with hostile tribes while transporting suspected witches into Indian territory. The first day's ride passed in tense silence as each member of the party struggled with their own fears and doubts. Dr. Webb found himself questioning everything he had learned in medical school as he watched Abby identify healing plants with casual expertise that surpassed any textbook knowledge. She would dismount periodically to gather specific herbs, explaining their properties in terms that blended Cherokee wisdom with practical experience. Her movements were efficient and purposeful, like a hunter who knew exactly where to find the prey she sought. "That's wild ginger root," she told Webb during one such stop, digging carefully around a cluster of heart-shaped leaves. "My grandmother used it to break fevers that white medicine couldn't touch, but it has to be harvested at the right time of day and prepared in a specific way, or it becomes poisonous instead of healing." Webb made careful notes in his journal, documenting not just the plants, but the methods, the timing, the almost ritualistic precision that governed traditional medicine. He was beginning to understand that what settlers dismissed as superstition was actually a sophisticated system of knowledge accumulated over countless generations, each remedy tested through trial and error until only the most effective survived. To be passed down to the next healer. Storm watched these interactions with growing respect for both healers. Webb's willingness to abandon his preconceptions and learn from Abby demonstrated the kind of courage that Comanche warriors recognized and valued, while Abby's patient teaching showed that she possessed not just knowledge, but wisdom, the understanding of how to share that knowledge with others who might use it to save lives. But as they traveled deeper into traditional Comanche hunting grounds, Storm's attention turned increasingly to signs that troubled his warrior's instincts: broken branches that indicated the passage of large groups, tracks that suggested families moving in haste rather than hunters pursuing game, and most ominously, the absence of the normal animal life that should have populated these grasslands. Even the birds seemed to have fled this region, leaving behind an eerie silence that made every hoofbeat sound like thunder. On the second morning, they encountered the first refugees, a family of Kiowa traveling south with all their possessions loaded onto travois poles, dragged by exhausted ponies. The father, a man Storm recognized as Standing Bear, carried his youngest son in his arms, the child's fevered breathing audible from 50 yards away, while his wife led two more children who stumbled with the characteristic weakness that marked the Red Death's early stages. Storm called out in the Kiowa language, offering water and temporary rest, but Standing Bear's response chilled him to the bone. "Brother, do not come closer. The evil spirits that bring death ride with us. Our medicine man has fallen, our elders have crossed to the spirit world, and now we flee to the southern tribes, hoping to find healers who can drive away this curse. Before it claims all our children." Abby urged her horse forward despite the obvious danger, her healer's instincts overriding normal caution. Storm asked him to describe the symptoms, the progression of the illness, anything that might help us understand what we're fighting. The conversation that followed revealed the true scope of the crisis they were riding toward. Standing Bear spoke of entire villages abandoned as the sickness spread faster than wildfire, of medicine men who died trying to treat patients they could not understand, of burial grounds that overflowed with victims while the living fled in terror, seeking help that might not exist anywhere in the territory. Dr. Webb listened to Storm's translation with growing alarm, recognizing patterns that matched his own observations, but on a scale that dwarfed anything he had imagined possible. "If this is spreading through the tribal populations at this rate," he whispered to Abby, "we could be looking at the complete collapse of the indigenous peoples throughout this region." Abby's response was to dismount and approach Standing Bear's sick child, moving slowly and respectfully, but with the confidence of someone who had faced similar situations before. She knelt beside the fevered boy, placing her hand gently on his forehead, while speaking soft words in Cherokee that seemed to calm both child and parents. Her examination was brief but thorough, checking pulse points, examining the distinctive rash, noting the pattern of breathing that had become her unwelcome expertise. "I can help him," she announced, returning to Storm and Webb. "But not here, not with the limited supplies we're carrying. He needs the full treatment that requires specific preparations and several days of careful monitoring. Can your people accept Kiowa refugees, at least temporarily?" Storm's expression grew troubled as he considered the political implications. Traditional rivalries between tribes ran deep, and the Comanche camp was already under stress from their own sick and dying. Adding Kiowa refugees would strain resources and potentially create conflicts that could explode into violence. But the alternative was to watch a child die when help was available. "I will ask my father," he decided. "Chief Thunderhawk has always honored the old laws of hospitality. But these are not normal times. Fear makes even good men do things they would normally consider shameful, Lieutenant Morrison had been watching these proceedings with growing unease. His military training taught him to view any gathering of Indians as a potential threat, and the idea of escorting civilians into what might become a refugee camp filled with desperate armed warriors made his stomach clench with anxiety. "Mr. Grey Wolf," he interrupted, "my orders are to ensure the safety of the medical personnel, not to negotiate refugee settlements if the situation becomes unstable." Storm's eyes flashed with controlled anger, but when he spoke, his voice remained carefully diplomatic. "Lieutenant, your government wants to prevent war between our peoples. Nothing would guarantee such a war faster than allowing children to... When help is available, sometimes preventing conflict requires taking risks that soldiers are taught to avoid." The exchange highlighted the fundamental tension underlying their entire mission. Military minds trained to think in terms of clear objectives and defined enemies, struggling to adapt to a situation where the real enemy was invisible and the only hope lay in unprecedented cooperation between traditional adversaries. As they prepared to resume their journey, now accompanied by the Kiowa family, Abby found herself riding beside Storm, their horses matching pace as naturally as if they had traveled together for years rather than days. She studied his profile. As he scanned the horizon, noting the way responsibility seemed to weigh on his young shoulders like a physical burden. "Tell me about your sister," she said quietly, understanding that grief shared was often grief reduced. "Storm, tell me about Running Deer." The name hit him like an arrow to the heart, but instead of closing off as she had expected, Storm began to speak, his voice low and careful as he painted a picture of a young woman who had embodied everything best about their people. Running Deer had been not just beautiful but intelligent, fluent in 3 tribal languages and passable in English. A skilled craftswoman who created beadwork that was traded as far south as Mexico, and a natural diplomat who could settle disputes between the most stubborn warriors. She was going to be married in the spring, Storm continued, his hands tightening on his reins, to Grey Eagle of the southern Comanche, a match that would have strengthened the alliance between our bands, brought peace to conflicts that had simmered for a generation. But then the sickness came, and all those plans, all those hopes, died with her. Abby listened without judgment or false comfort, recognizing that Storm needed to voice his pain. More than he needed sympathy, she had seen this pattern before in families who had lost children to diseases they could not understand or fight. The guilt and helplessness that ate away at survivors like acid, corroding their ability to hope or trust in the future. "My grandmother always said that the dead never truly leave us," she offered. "They become part of our knowledge, part of our strength. Running Deer's death taught you something about fighting this sickness, even if you don't realize it yet." Storm considered her words as they crested a ridge that offered their first view of the Comanche winter camp, spread across a protected valley where a meandering stream provided fresh water and cottonwood groves offered shelter from the endless prairie wind. But what should have been a thriving community showed obvious signs of crisis: too few cooking, fires, burial scaffolds that had not been there when Storm departed, and an overall air of subdued desperation that hung over the camp like smoke from a funeral pyre. Dr. Webb drew rein beside them, his experienced eye immediately cataloguing the signs of a community under siege. "How many people in the camp?" he asked, already calculating medical supplies against potential patients. 300, maybe a little more," Storm replied, "but that includes children, elders and families from 2 other bands that sought refuge here when the sickness reached their own camps. My father has been trying to hold everyone together, but leadership becomes difficult when people are dying, and you have no answers to offer." The descent into the valley proceeded slowly, both to avoid appearing threatening and to give the camp scouts time to identify the approaching party. Storm had sent a rider ahead at dawn to announce their arrival, But in times of crisis, even expected visitors might be greeted with suspicion rather than welcome, especially when they included white soldiers and a woman whose very presence challenged traditional gender roles. As they drew closer, figures began emerging from the scattered teepees, warriors with weapons ready but not openly threatening, women clutching children who peered curiously at the strange procession, and elders whose weathered faces showed the strain of making impossible decisions in impossible circumstances. At the center of the gathering stood a man whose bearing immediately identified him as Chief Thunderhawk, Storm's father and leader of the northern Comanche. The resemblance between father and son was unmistakable, the same proud bearing, the same intelligent eyes that seemed to weigh and measure everything they saw, but where Storm radiated youthful energy and optimism, Thunderhawk carried the heavy dignity of a leader who had seen too much change, fought too many losing battles, and buried too many of his people. His greeting to his son was warm but restrained, appropriate for a public reunion between chief and war leader. "My son returns," Thunderhawk said in Comanche, his voice carrying clearly across the gathering crowd, "and he brings strangers to our fire. I hope he also brings wisdom, for we have great need of both." Storm dismounted and approached his father with the respect due a chief, but Abby could see the personal pain that flickered between them, the shared grief for running deer that would never fully heal, the weight of leadership that had aged Thunderhawk beyond his years, and the desperate hope that somehow this unlikely alliance might succeed where traditional medicine had failed. "Father," Storm replied formally, "I bring healers who know the old ways and the new, a medicine woman whose grandmother fought this same sickness among the Cherokee, and a white doctor who seeks to learn rather than to conquer. They have come freely, asking only the chance to help our people survive." The translation created a stir among the gathered Comanche, some nodding approval at Storm's diplomatic success, others muttering suspicions about trusting outsiders with their tribe's survival. But Thunderhawk's attention focused immediately on Abby, studying her with the intensity of a leader who had learned to read character in faces and bearing. "You are the woman they would have killed," he said in careful English. "My son says you possess knowledge that could save our children, but knowledge can be as dangerous as ignorance. How do we know that your medicine will not bring more death among us?" Abby met his gaze directly, understanding that this moment would determine not just her acceptance, but the entire mission's success or failure. "Chief Thunderhawk," she replied, "I cannot promise that my medicine will save everyone. The sickness we fight is ancient and powerful, but I can promise that I will share everything I know, hold nothing back, and treat your people with the same care I would give my own family." Thunderhawk studied her for a long moment that seemed to stretch like eternity, while the gathered tribe waited for their leader's decision, the fate of the unprecedented alliance hanging in the balance like smoke in still air. Thunderhawk's decision came not with words, but with action. The Comanche chief stepped forward and placed his weathered hand on Abby's shoulder in the traditional gesture of acceptance. But before the gathered tribe could fully register this momentous act, a commotion erupted from the direction of the medicine lodge where the most critically ill patients were being tended. A woman's anguished cry pierced the air, followed by the haunting death song that marked another soul's passage to the spirit world. White Dove, the tribe's most respected medicine woman, emerged from the lodge with tears streaming down her painted face, her arms raised toward the sky in the ancient gesture of mourning. "Another child has crossed over," she announced in Comanche, her voice breaking with exhaustion and despair. "Little Fox, son of Broken Arrow, the fever spirits have claimed him despite all our efforts." The crowd that had gathered to witness the arrival of the outsiders suddenly seemed to fragment, some rushing toward the medicine lodge to comfort the grieving family, others turning away as if proximity to death might invite its attention to their own loved ones. and still others directing suspicious glares toward Abby and Dr. Webb, as if the timing of this latest tragedy was somehow connected to the presence of foreign healers. Storm felt his father's hand tighten on his shoulder, the weight of leadership and loss pressing down on the chief like a physical burden. Thunderhawk had already buried too many of his people, watched too many families destroyed by an enemy that could not be fought with traditional weapons, and now he was being asked to gamble his tribe's survival on the promises of strangers whose methods defied everything his culture understood about medicine and healing. White Dove speaks against bringing outsiders to tend our sick. Thunder, Hawk said quietly to Storm, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of a leader trying to balance competing factions within his own people. She says the spirits are angry that we would turn away from the old ways in our moment of greatest need. Dr. Webb stepped forward, his medical bag clutched in his hands like a talisman. Chief Thunderhawk, I understand the reluctance to trust foreign methods, but I've seen what this disease can do when left unchecked. Entire communities wiped out, families destroyed. If there's any chance that combining our knowledge with your traditional medicine could save lives, isn't that chance worth taking? Before Thunderhawk could respond, White Dove approached their group, her expression a mixture of grief, exhaustion, and barely controlled anger. She was a woman in her 50s who commanded immense respect among the Comanche for her knowledge of healing herbs and her ability to communicate with the spirit world. But the current crisis had pushed her beyond the limits of traditional medicine, leaving her feeling helpless and increasingly desperate. "You bring white man's medicine to our people," she said to Storm in accented English, her voice sharp, with accusation. "But white man's medicine has never cured what white man's diseases have brought among us. Your sister died despite all our prayers and ceremonies. What makes you think these strangers can succeed where our own spirits have failed?" The challenge hung in the air like smoke from a sacred fire, touching on the deepest fears and suspicions that divided not just the Comanche, but all the tribes struggling to survive in a rapidly changing world. The question of whether traditional ways could adapt to new threats, or whether embracing foreign solutions meant abandoning everything that made them who they were. Abby recognized the moment for what it was, a test that would determine not just her acceptance, but the entire future of their desperate alliance. She had faced similar challenges in Cherokee communities where her mixed heritage made her suspect to purists who believed contamination with white blood weakened traditional medicine. But she had learned that healing transcended cultural boundaries when lives hung in the balance. "White Dove," she said, using the medicine woman's name with the respect due an elder, "I honor your knowledge and your dedication to your people. My grandmother taught me that true healing comes not from abandoning old ways, but from combining them with new understanding. May I share with you what the Cherokee learned about fighting this same sickness?" The offer was diplomatically perfect, framing cooperation as cultural exchange rather than replacement, acknowledging White Dove's authority while offering to enhance rather than challenge her methods. But the older woman's response revealed the depth of her distrust and the pressure she was under from tribal conservatives who saw any compromise as betrayal. "Your grandmother," White Dove said with bitter emphasis, "taught you to speak our languages and use our plants, but did she teach you to hear the voices of our spirits, to understand the sacred balance that governs all healing? Or do you simply take our knowledge and mix it with white man's poison?" Dr. Webb sensed the conversation was reaching a critical point where the wrong word could destroy any chance of cooperation. But his scientific training had not prepared him for negotiating with spiritual leaders whose worldview incorporated elements that medical school had taught him to dismiss as superstition. He found himself caught between his desire to help and his inability to bridge cultural gaps that seemed vast as canyons. Storm stepped into the growing tension with the diplomatic skills inherited from his father. "White Dove, honored healer of our people, the sickness that has taken running deer and little fox and so many others. It does not respect our traditions or their traditions. It kills Cherokee children and Comanche children with equal hunger. Perhaps the spirits themselves have brought these healers to us, seeking new ways to fight an enemy that our old methods cannot defeat. The argument was cleverly constructed to reframe foreign assistance as spiritual guidance rather than cultural betrayal, suggesting that the spirits themselves might be working through unlikely channels to save the Comanche people. It was exactly the kind of reasoning that might persuade someone whose resistance was based on religious rather than practical concerns. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. But before White Dove could respond, another crisis erupted that would test all their theories in the most practical way possible. A young warrior named Swift Horse came running from the eastern edge of the camp, his face flushed with exertion and his eyes wide with panic. "Chief Thunder Hawk," he gasped, riders approaching from the south, soldiers wearing the blue coats, many soldiers, more than we have ever seen in this valley. The news sent shock waves through the gathering, transforming what had been a medical and cultural debate into a potential military crisis. Storm's mind raced through the possibilities, trying to understand how federal troops had located their camp and what their intentions might be. The presence of Lieutenant Morrison's small escort should have been sufficient to ensure safe passage, unless something had gone catastrophically wrong back in Willow Creek. Thunderhawk's transformation from grieving father to war chief was instantaneous, his voice carrying the authority of generations of warriors as he began issuing orders. "Swift Horse, gather the Council of Elders, Grey Wolf, take 20 men and prepare defensive positions along the ridge. All women and children to the sacred grove, where the spirits will protect them." But Storm raised his hand, his voice urgent with realization. "Father, wait. If soldiers are coming in force, it may not be to attack, but to investigate. The sickness has spread far beyond our camp. Perhaps the white leaders finally understand that this threatens everyone, not just the tribes." Dr. Webb's face had gone pale as he considered the implications. If word has reached the territorial capital that we're treating Indian patients, if politicians are looking for scapegoats to blame for the epidemic's spread, they might be coming to arrest us as traitors or worse. The possibility that their medical mission could be misinterpreted as collaboration with hostile forces added another layer of complexity to an already desperate situation. Abby found herself caught between two worlds that seemed determined to view her as either a traitor or a spy, depending on which side was making the judgment. Lieutenant Morrison, who had been maintaining a tactful silence during the cultural negotiations, suddenly stepped forward with his military training taking precedence over diplomatic considerations. "Chief Thunderhawk, if federal troops are approaching in significant numbers, I need to make contact and identify our party before any misunderstandings occur. My soldiers and I are responsible for protecting the medical personnel." The lieutenant's words reminded everyone that their unlikely alliance existed within a larger framework of potential conflict that could explode into violence if handled incorrectly. The approaching soldiers might view Morrison's presence as evidence of tribal cooperation, or they might see it as proof that he had been captured or turned against his own people. But the immediate crisis was interrupted by an unexpected development that would change the entire dynamic of their situation. A child's voice calling from the direction of the medicine lodge, high and clear, with the kind of joy that had been absent from the camp for weeks. "Little Fox is breathing. Little Fox is awake. The fever spirits have left him." White Dove's head snapped up like a startled deer, her expression transforming from anger to amazement as she processed the impossible news. Little Fox had been pronounced dead barely an hour earlier, his small body still and cold to the touch. But now excited voices were confirming that somehow, impossibly, the child was not only alive, but appeared to be recovering. The medicine woman ran toward the lodge with a speed that belied her age, followed by a growing crowd of Comanche who had heard the miraculous news. Dr. Webb and Abby exchanged meaningful glances before joining the rush, their medical training demanding they investigate what could only be described as a resurrection. Inside the medicine lodge, they found little Fox sitting up on his sleeping robes, weak but clearly alive, his eyes bright with intelligence and his skin free of the angry red rash that had marked the disease's progress. His mother, Singing Bird, knelt beside him with tears of joy streaming down her face, while his father, Broken Arrow, stood frozen in amazement as if afraid that movement might shatter the miracle. White Dove's examination was thorough and professional despite her emotional state, checking pulse points, examining skin for signs of fever, testing the child's responses to light and sound with the systematic approach of someone whose life had been devoted to understanding the human body's mysteries. Her growing amazement was evident in every gesture. "The fever has broken completely," she announced to the gathered crowd, her voice filled with wonder. "The rash has faded. His breathing is clear and strong. This child was walking the spirit path, and somehow he has returned to us." Dr. Webb's scientific mind struggled to process what he was observing. In his experience, patients who had progressed to little Fox's stage of the disease simply did not recover. The fever patterns and respiratory symptoms they had documented suggested irreversible damage to vital organs. Yet here was evidence that challenged everything medical science understood about this particular plague. What treatment was he receiving? Abby asked White Dove, her own understanding of traditional medicine making her suspect that some combination of factors had created the unexpected recovery. Were there any changes in the ceremonies or medicines used? White Dove's response revealed a detail that would prove crucial to understanding their situation. "When the death songs began, I gave him the last of the sacred root that grows only in the hidden canyon, the root that my grandmother's grandmother saved for the darkest times, but there was barely enough for one small dose." The mention of sacred root immediately captured Abby's attention. Her grandmother's journals had described similar emergency medicines used by various tribes, concentrated preparations that were reserved for the most desperate cases because of their rarity and the dangers involved in their preparation. If such a substance existed and could be replicated, it might represent the breakthrough they had been seeking. But their medical discussion was interrupted by the thunder of approaching hoofbeats. The federal troops that Swifthorse had spotted were now visible through the lodge's entrance, a full cavalry company riding in formation toward the Comanche camp, their blue uniforms and glinting weapons creating a sight that had struck terror into tribal hearts for more than a generation. Storm emerged from the lodge to find his father already mounted on his warhorse, surrounded by 30 painted warriors ready to defend their people against whatever threat the soldiers represented. The transformation of the camp from medical crisis to potential battlefield had taken only minutes, but the stakes could not have been higher. At the head of the approaching column rode a figure that made both Storm and Dr. Webb inhale sharply with recognition and concern. Colonel Marcus Thornfield of the 3rd Cavalry, known throughout the territory as the Hammer for his ruthless efficiency in dealing with tribal resistance, his presence suggested that whatever had brought the soldiers here went far beyond medical concerns. "This changes everything," Dr. Webb whispered to Abby as they watched the military force deploy in classic attack formation. "Thornfield doesn't negotiate. He dictates terms. If he's decided that this medical mission represents some kind of threat to territorial security..." The doctor's words were cut off by the sound of a bugle call echoing across the valley. The sharp notes, carrying the authority of the United States Army and the implicit threat of overwhelming force. But as the last note faded into silence, an unexpected voice called out from the cavalry ranks, speaking in fluent Comanche. "Chief, Thunderhawk of the Northern Comanche, I am Colonel Thornfield. I come under flag of truce to discuss matters that concern both our peoples. I request parley according to the old agreements between our governments." The formal request for negotiation rather than immediate attack surprised everyone, including Storm and his father. Thornfield's reputation suggested he preferred action to diplomacy. His presence here under a truce flag indicated that something had fundamentally changed in the government's approach to the current crisis. Thunderhawk's response was equally formal, acknowledging the request while maintaining the dignity appropriate to a sovereign leader. "Colonel Thornfield, you are recognized under the laws of parley. What brings the bluecoats to our winter? Camp in such numbers." The answer would reveal stakes that none of them had imagined possible, transforming their desperate medical mission into something that could determine the fate of every tribe in the Montana Territory. Colonel Thornfield, dismounted from his black stallion with the calculated precision of a man who understood that every gesture carried political weight. His weathered face bore the scars of 20 years fighting Indian wars, but his eyes held something unexpected, not the cold fury of a soldier seeking vengeance, but the desperate calculation of a leader facing an enemy that cavalry charges could not defeat. Behind him, his aide-de-camp carried a leather satchel that bulged with official documents, suggesting this parley involved more than simple military threats. The tension in the valley was thick as smoke from a grass fire. 30 Comanche warriors sat their painted ponies in perfect formation, their weapons ready but not openly threatening, while a full company of cavalry spread across the opposite ridge like a blue wave, frozen at the moment of breaking. Between them stood the unlikely alliance of healers whose work had brought both sides to this unprecedented moment of potential cooperation or catastrophic conflict. "Chief Thunderhawk," Thornfield began, his voice carrying across the tense space between the two forces. "3 days ago, I received orders from Washington that changed everything we thought we knew about this crisis. The Secretary of War has declared a territorial health emergency, suspending normal military operations in favor of a coordinated response to what experts are calling the worst epidemic in frontier history." The revelation sent shockwaves through both camps. Storm exchanged glances with his father, recognizing that federal acknowledgement of the crisis represented either unprecedented opportunity for cooperation or a trap designed to gather all the tribes in one place for easier elimination. Thunderhawk's expression remained carefully neutral, but his grip on his warlance tightened imperceptibly as he calculated the implications of such a dramatic policy shift. Dr. Webb stepped forward from the Comanche ranks, his civilian status giving him diplomatic immunity that soldiers could not claim. "Colonel Thornfield, I'm Dr. Harrison Webb. I've been documenting the spread of this epidemic from Fort Kellogg to 7 settlements. If Washington is finally taking this seriously, then we need to share information immediately. Every day, we delay costs lives that could be saved." Thornfield's eyes fixed on the doctor with the intensity of a hawk spotting prey. His military training had taught him to assess threats and opportunities with equal precision, and Webb's presence among the Comanche suggested either treason or unprecedented cooperation that could benefit both sides. "Dr. Webb, your reports to the Territorial Medical Board have been forwarded to the highest levels of government. Your recommendation for unprecedented cooperation between military medicine and tribal healers has been approved, but implementation comes with conditions that may prove difficult for all parties to accept." The colonel's aide, a nervous young lieutenant who clearly wished he was anywhere else in the territory, opened the satchel and withdrew a thick document bearing multiple official seals. The papers rustled in the prairie wind like leaves before a storm. As he prepared to read the formal orders, that would either forge a new relationship between the government and the tribes or provide legal justification for actions that neither side wanted to contemplate. But before the lieutenant could begin reading, a commotion erupted from the direction of the cavalry ranks as a familiar figure pushed through the mounted soldiers, Sheriff Jonas Mitchell of Willow Creek, his face flushed with rage, and his hand, resting on his gun butt, had somehow attached himself to Thornfield's expedition, despite having no official authority beyond the boundaries of his own settlement. "Colonel, that's her!" Mitchell shouted, pointing an accusing finger at Abby with the zealous fury of a man whose worldview had been challenged beyond his ability to cope. "That's the witch who poisoned our children and started this whole plague. She's been spreading the sickness deliberately, probably on orders from hostile tribes. You can't seriously be considering negotiating with terrorists and their accomplices." The accusation hung in the air like gun smoke, transforming what had been a tense but hopeful diplomatic moment into a potential powder keg that could explode. Into violence at the slightest provocation, Storm's hand moved instinctively to his war club, while several Comanche warriors notched arrows to their bowstrings, ready to defend their guests against what they perceived as treachery disguised as negotiation. Abby felt the familiar weight of false accusations pressing down on her like a physical burden. But this time she was not alone on a platform facing an angry mob. Storm positioned himself slightly in front of her in a gesture of protection that did not go unnoticed by either the tribal warriors or the federal soldiers, his presence a reminder that she now had allies who would not abandon her to the mercy of prejudiced men seeking scapegoats for tragedies beyond their understanding. But Thornfield's response surprised everyone, including his own men. Instead of supporting Mitchell's accusations, the colonel turned on the sheriff with barely controlled fury that spoke of military discipline strained to its breaking point. "Sheriff Mitchell, you were specifically ordered to remain in Willow Creek and maintain quarantine procedures. Your unauthorized presence here violates direct orders from Territorial Command and endangers a mission of critical importance to national security." Mitchell's face went white as he realized he had seriously miscalculated the political situation. His certainty about Abby's guilt had blinded him to the larger forces at work. "Colonel, I have a duty to pursue criminals who escape my jurisdiction. This woman is a wanted fugitive who must answer for the deaths of innocent children." "This woman," Thornfield interrupted with deadly calm that made his soldiers straighten their spines instinctively, "is operating under federal protection as a designated medical consultant. Any interference with her mission constitutes obstruction of military operations during a declared emergency. Sergeant Williams, place Sheriff Mitchell under protective custody until this crisis is resolved." The swift reversal of Mitchell's fortunes demonstrated that the federal response to the epidemic had indeed changed everything, but it also revealed the depth of local resistance that any cooperation would have to overcome, as two soldiers moved to escort the protesting sheriff. Away from the parley site, Abby found herself at the center of a political storm that had implications far beyond her personal safety. White Dove, who had been watching these developments with the shrewd intelligence of someone who had survived decades of white politics and learned to read the currents of power that determined her people's fate, stepped forward to address Thornfield directly. Her traditional dress and ceremonial paint marking her as a representative of old ways that predated American expansion into tribal lands. "Blue Coat Chief," she said, her English carefully precise despite her obvious preference for her native tongue. "You speak of cooperation between your healers and ours, but your people have never honored such agreements before. Treaties signed in good faith become broken promises when convenient. What makes this sickness different from all the others that your government ignored when they only killed Indians?" The medicine woman's challenge cut to the heart of the historical mistrust that poisoned relations between the tribes and federal authorities. Decades of broken treaties and abandoned promises had taught native leaders to view any white overture with deep suspicion, especially when it came during moments of tribal vulnerability, when desperate circumstances might cloud judgment about long-term consequences. Thunderhawk nodded approvingly at White Dove's question, recognizing that she had voiced the concerns that every tribal leader harbored about federal promises. His own experience with government representatives had taught him that their word was often as changeable as prairie weather, reliable only as long as it served their immediate interests. Thornfield's answer revealed the true scope of the crisis that had forced Washington to abandon its traditional policies and consider alternatives that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. White Dove, honored healer of the Comanche people, this sickness has now reached the eastern cities, Philadelphia, New York, Boston, all reporting cases with symptoms identical to what you've experienced here. The president himself has family members showing early signs of the disease, and the governors of 3 states have demanded federal intervention using any means necessary. The stunning revelation that the epidemic had reached the highest levels of American society explained everything about the government's sudden willingness to cooperate with tribal medicine. When the plague threatened only frontier settlements and Indian reservations, it could be ignored or blamed on savage practices. But when it began killing the families of politicians and industrialists, it became a national emergency, requiring desperate measures that overrode normal prejudices. Dr. Webb's scientific mind immediately grasped the implications of Thornfield's revelation, his medical training allowing him to calculate the speed and scope of transmission that such widespread infection represented. If this disease has spread that far that quickly, covering thousands of miles in a matter of weeks, we're not dealing with a localized outbreak, but with something that could threaten the entire continental population. The traditional quarantine methods won't work against something this virulent. We need every possible treatment option, regardless of its cultural origin. Storm saw opportunity in the crisis, recognizing that his people's survival might depend on proving their value to a government that had previously seen them only as obstacles to expansion and progress. Colonel Thornfield, if your leaders truly want our help, then they must treat us as equals in this fight, not as subjects to be commanded, but as allies whose knowledge could save both our peoples. Cooperation requires respect, not charity disguised. As diplomacy, the diplomatic challenge was perfectly calibrated to test Thornfield's sincerity while establishing terms that would preserve Comanche dignity and autonomy. But before the colonel could respond, another voice cut through the tension with the authority of absolute conviction. A voice that carried the educated accent of Eastern universities and the arrogance of someone accustomed to being considered the smartest person in any room. Elena Vasquez, the graduate student whose false accusations had destroyed Dr. Marcus. Chen's career at Stanford emerged from behind the cavalry ranks, where she had been serving as a medical consultant to the territorial government. Her appearance was calculated to project scientific authority. Dressed in practical traveling clothes, but carrying herself with the confidence of someone whose expertise was beyond question. "Colonel, you can't seriously be considering trusting the medical practices of savages," Eleanor declared with the casual racism that characterized much of academic discourse about indigenous peoples. These people don't understand basic sanitation or scientific method. Their so-called medicine is nothing but superstition mixed with dangerous folklore that could actually make the epidemic worse. Her appearance at this crucial moment sent shockwaves through the assembled groups. Dr. Webb recognized her immediately from newspaper accounts of the Stanford scandal, while Abby sensed something familiar about the woman's aggressive dismissal of traditional healing methods, the kind of prejudice that had haunted mixed heritage healers for generations and made their work exponentially more difficult. Storm studied Eleanor with the warrior's instinct for detecting enemies, noting the way she positioned herself to command attention, the calculated timing of her intervention, and most importantly, the subtle signs of deception that his training had taught him to recognize in both human and animal adversaries. This woman was dangerous in ways that went beyond simple prejudice. But Elena's most devastating revelation was yet to come. As she continued her assault on the proposed cooperation with the confidence of someone who believed her superior education made her untouchable. Furthermore, I have evidence that this epidemic originated in tribal territories and was deliberately spread to white settlements as part of a coordinated campaign of biological warfare. My research has identified specific patterns that prove these attacks were planned and executed with scientific precision. The accusation of biological warfare sent ripples of shock through both the military and tribal representatives, transforming what had been a medical crisis into a potential casus belli that could justify the kind of military response that would solve the Indian problem permanently. Elena's words carried the weight of scientific authority that politicians and generals found more persuasive than eyewitness testimony or traditional knowledge. "Your research," Dr. Webb interrupted with barely controlled rage, his own scientific training allowing him to recognize the methodological flaws and outright fabrications that characterized Elena's work, consists entirely of fabricated data and stolen work. Elena Vasquez, you're a fraud who destroyed an innocent man's career to cover your own incompetence. And now you're trying to sabotage efforts to save lives because you can't stand the thought of native medicine succeeding where your stolen algorithms failed. The public exposure of Elena's academic crimes sent ripples of shock through both the military and tribal representatives. But her response revealed the depths of her desperation and racial hatred, combined with the kind of megalomania that could transform personal failure into genocidal ambition. You've all been deceived by clever savages who understand exactly how to manipulate white guilt and liberal sympathies. This whole epidemic is a hoax designed to gain sympathy and political leverage while weakening American defenses against tribal aggression. Storm's warrior training took over as he recognized Elena as the kind of enemy who could destroy everything they were trying to build. Her ability to influence military policy through false science posed a direct threat to his people's survival. And Comanche tradition demanded immediate action against such threats. "This woman speaks lies that could cost thousands of lives," he announced in a voice that carried across the entire valley. "Among my people, such lies would be answered with blood. But perhaps your justice will prove more effective than ours." The confrontation was escalating toward violence when an unexpected intervention changed everything, Little Fox. The child who had miraculously recovered from near death through White Dove's use of the sacred root appeared at his mother's side carrying a small bundle wrapped in soft deerskin. His young voice cut through the adult arguments with the clarity of innocence that had not yet learned to doubt its own perceptions. "The white woman with the angry voice," Little Fox said in Comanche, his words immediately translated by several tribal members. "She smells like the bad medicine that made the other children sick, the smell that comes from plants when they are mixed to bring death instead of healing." The child's observation, delivered with the straightforward honesty that only children possess, hit the assembled adults like a physical blow. Singing Bird, Little Fox's mother, immediately knelt beside her son to translate his words more precisely while studying Eleanor with the protective instincts of a mother who had nearly lost her child to the epidemic. "He says the woman carries the scent of the poison plants," Singing Bird explained, her voice growing stronger with conviction. "The ones that make healing herbs dangerous when mixed incorrectly. The plants that our medicine women are taught to recognize and avoid, but that could be used by someone who wanted to cause harm rather than healing." Dr. Webb's medical training suddenly connected disparate pieces of evidence that had been troubling him since the crisis began. Patterns in the epidemic's spread that defied normal disease transmission, clusters of infection that seemed to follow human travel routes rather than natural vectors, and most importantly, the specific symptom progression that suggested artificial enhancement of natural pathogens. "Elena," he said, his voice deadly quiet with the kind of calm that preceded explosive action, "show me your research materials, the samples you collected from affected settlements. Show me everything you've been carrying. Let's examine your evidence under proper scientific scrutiny." But Elena was already backing toward the cavalry horses, her face pale with the realization that her carefully constructed deception was crumbling under examination by people who possessed both scientific training and cultural knowledge that she had never anticipated. "I don't have to submit to interrogation by discredited doctors and savage witch doctors. Colonel Thornfield, order your men to arrest these terrorists before they spread more lies and endanger federal personnel." Thornfield, however, was beginning to see the pattern that Dr. Webb had identified. His military experience with biological warfare during the Civil War made him acutely aware of how diseases could be weaponized, and Elena's defensive reaction was raising red flags that his training taught him to never ignore, especially when the lives of his men and the stability of the entire territory hung in the balance. "Miss Vasquez," he said, with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question, "as the senior federal official present, I'm ordering you to submit to medical examination of your possessions and research materials. Failure to comply will result in immediate arrest and military trial for obstruction of emergency operations." The order triggered Elena's final desperate gambit, revealing the true depths of her madness and the carefully planned nature of what everyone had assumed was a natural epidemic. She pulled a small glass vial from her coat pocket, holding it high above her head like a weapon, while backing toward the edge of the camp where escape might still be possible. "This contains concentrated samples of the epidemic strain," she screamed, her scientific composure completely shattered to reveal the fanatical hatred underneath. "If any of you move against me, I'll smash it and guarantee that everyone in this valley dies within days. You'll all become victims of the biological weapon you're too stupid to recognize." The threat revealed the true scope of her madness and the carefully planned nature of what she was calling an epidemic. Storm's eyes met Abby's across the tense space between the opposing forces, both recognizing that they were facing not a natural disaster, but a deliberately created biological weapon, and that Elena Vasquez was not just a fraud, but a terrorist whose actions had already killed hundreds of innocent people across the territory. The glass vial trembled in Elena's grip as she backed toward the edge of the Comanche camp. Her eyes, wild with the desperation of someone whose carefully constructed lies were crumbling faster than she could rebuild them. The concentrated biological weapon she held represented months of painstaking work, cultivating and enhancing natural pathogens, until they became something far deadlier than anything nature had produced. Her twisted genius had created a plague specifically designed to devastate both tribal populations and frontier settlements. But Elena had made one critical miscalculation in her mad scheme for revenge and recognition. She had underestimated the courage of people who had already faced death and emerged stronger. As she raised the vial higher, threatening to smash it against the rocks that marked the camp's boundary, a figure emerged from the cottonwood grove where he had been waiting for exactly this moment, moving with the patient precision of a hunter who had tracked his prey across hundreds of miles. Marcus Chen stepped into the open with his rifle already aimed, his once soft academic features hardened by months of pursuing the woman who had destroyed his career and turned his groundbreaking research into an instrument of mass murder, the disgraced Stanford professor had become something Elena never expected, a man with nothing left to lose and everything to gain from seeing justice. Finally served, Elena Vasquez, Marcus called out, his voice carrying the authority of absolute moral certainty. You stole my work, destroyed my reputation, and perverted my research into a weapon of genocide. But your greatest crime was making me doubt myself when I should have been stopping you. The appearance of her former victim sent Elena into a panic that shattered her last vestiges of scientific composure. She had believed Marcus was broken, hiding somewhere in shame and obscurity while she built her career on his stolen algorithms. The reality that he had been systematically unraveling her conspiracy while gathering evidence of her crimes was more terrifying than any military threat. "Marcus, you pathetic fool!" she screamed, her academic arrogance warring with growing terror. You think you can undo what I've accomplished. You think your wounded pride matters more than the advancement of scientific knowledge. I took your work and made it into something that will reshape the demographic balance of the entire American frontier. Her confession sent shockwaves through the assembled witnesses, transforming what everyone had assumed was academic rivalry into something far more sinister. Elena was not just claiming credit for stolen research, but admitting to using that research as the foundation for biological warfare against entire populations. Her words revealed a depth of evil that transcended normal human understanding. Dr. Webb felt his medical oath burning in his chest, like a physical pain, as he realized the scope of Elena's betrayal of everything science was supposed to represent. You perverted the art of healing into an instrument of murder, he said, his voice thick with disgust. You took research designed to save lives and turned it into a weapon designed to commit genocide. Storm watched Elena with the focused intensity of a warrior who had finally identified the true enemy. Her confession had answered questions that had been haunting him since his sister's death. The unnatural progression of symptoms, the way the disease seemed to target specific populations, the failure of traditional treatments that should have been effective against normal pathogens. Running Deer died because of your poison, he said, his voice carrying the weight of personal loss and tribal grief. She died in agony while I held her hand and promised to find answers. Now I understand that she was murdered by someone who saw her death as nothing more than data in a scientific experiment. Thunderhawk's expression transformed as he grasped the full implications of Elena's confession. His daughter had not been claimed by natural sickness or enemy action, but by the calculated malice of someone who viewed native people as laboratory animals. The revelation filled him with a cold fury that was far more dangerous than hot anger. But Elena's response revealed that her madness went even deeper than anyone had imagined. Her academic failure had twisted into a genocidal vision that she genuinely believed was justified by scientific progress. Your people were already dying, she declared with the casual cruelty of someone who had lost all connection to human empathy, disease, warfare, the inevitable march of civilization. I simply accelerated the process while gathering valuable data about pathogen transmission in isolated populations. The monstrous logic of her justification sent ripples of horror through both the military and tribal representatives. Elena was not just admitting to mass murder, but defending it as a form of scientific research. Her perverted understanding of progress and civilization had turned her into something that transcended normal categories of evil. Colonel Thornfield's military training had prepared him for many forms of enemy action, but the calculated cruelty of biological warfare against civilian populations was something that challenged his fundamental understanding of honorable conflict. Miss Vasquez, you are under arrest for crimes against humanity, treason against the United States, and the murder of American citizens. Surrender immediately or face the consequences." Elena's laughter was high and brittle, the sound of sanity finally snapping under the weight of exposure and inevitable punishment. "Arrest me!" she shrieked, raising the vial higher. "Arrest me and watch everyone in this valley die. Arrest me and explain to Washington how your cooperation with savages led to the death of a full cavalry company." But Marcus had been preparing for this moment since the day he discovered Elena's conspiracy. His months of investigation had revealed not just her crimes, but her psychological patterns, her need to be seen as the smartest person in any situation, her compulsion to explain her superiority even when explanation meant self-destruction. "Elena," he said, his voice suddenly calm and almost conversational, "there's something you should know about the algorithm you stole from me. Something I never published because I wasn't sure it was ready for practical application." The shift in his tone caught Elena's attention despite her hysteria, her academic curiosity overriding her survival instincts as she paused to listen, still holding the vial, but no longer preparing to smash it. "What are you talking about?" I perfected. "Your crude research, I turned your theoretical framework into practical applications." Marcus smiled with the satisfaction of a man who had planned this moment with infinite care. "The algorithm had a built-in safeguard, a kill switch that I embedded in the core code to prevent exactly the kind of misuse you've been pursuing. Every enhancement you made based on my work carries that same vulnerability." The revelation hit Elena like a physical blow as she realized the implications. Her enhanced pathogens were not the perfect weapon she believed them to be, but ticking time bombs that could be neutralized by someone who understood their fundamental architecture. Her months of careful cultivation and enhancement had created not invulnerable bioweapons, but elaborate traps that could be triggered by their own creators' hidden programming. "You're lying," she gasped, but her voice carried the uncertainty of someone whose absolute confidence was beginning to crack. "I analyzed every line of code. I understood every component of the system." "You understood what you wanted to understand," Marcus replied, pulling a small device from his coat pocket, "but you never questioned why certain subroutines were embedded so deeply in the core architecture. You assumed they were inefficiencies rather than safeguards." Dr. Webb recognized the device as some form of electronic transmitter, probably designed to broadcast specific frequency patterns that would interact with the biological agents Elena had created. If Marcus was telling the truth about embedded safeguards, then the man was literally holding the key to neutralizing the entire biological threat. Elena's face went white as she realized that her perfect weapon was about to become her own destruction. The vial in her hand contained not salvation, but suicide, engineered by the very man whose work she had stolen and perverted. "If you activate that device," she warned, "you'll kill everyone who's been exposed to the enhanced pathogens." "No," Marcus said with quiet certainty. "The safeguard is designed to neutralize the artificial enhancements while leaving the natural immune system intact. The original pathogens will become treatable with conventional medicine, but your weapons-grade modifications will simply cease to function." The standoff had reached its climactic moment, Elena holding a vial of concentrated death, while Marcus controlled the means to neutralize her entire conspiracy. But before either could act, Little Fox spoke again, with the innocent clarity that had already exposed so much hidden truth. "The bad medicine is already dying," the child said in Comanche, his words immediately translated by his mother. "I can smell it becoming weak, like flowers that wilt when the seasons change." Singing Bird studied her son's face with the intensity of a mother who had learned to trust his unusual perceptions. "He says The poison in the woman's bottle is losing its strength, becoming harmless like old herbs that have lost their power. Eleanor looked down at the vial in her hands and screamed as she realized that the child was right. The concentrated pathogen sample was already showing signs of degradation. Its carefully maintained chemical balance disrupted by exposure to air and temperature fluctuations. Her perfect weapon was becoming nothing more dangerous than contaminated water. In that moment of realization and rage, Elena made her final mistake. She hurled the vial toward the ground, not to threaten others, but to destroy the evidence of her failure. But Storm Greywolf was already moving, his warrior reflexes allowing him to intercept the falling glass before it could shatter, catching Elena's biological weapon in his bare hands, with the casual grace of someone who had spent his life performing impossible feats of timing and coordination. The capture of the vial marked the end of Elena's threat, and the beginning of a reckoning that would reshape the entire territory as Colonel Thornfield's soldiers moved to arrest the woman whose manufactured plague had brought two peoples to the brink of war. The real work of healing could finally begin in earnest. But the immediate crisis was far from over. Hundreds of people across the territory were still fighting infections that Elena's weapons had created. The sacred root that had saved Little Fox existed in quantities too small to treat all the victims. And the alliance between tribal and white medicine remained fragile as morning frost, ready to shatter at the first sign of renewed mistrust or political pressure. Dr. Webb approached Thunderhawk and Storm with the careful respect of someone who understood that the next few minutes would determine whether their unprecedented cooperation could survive Elena's exposure. Chief Thunderhawk, with your permission, I'd like to work with White Dove and Abby to analyze the sacred root that saved Little Fox. If we can understand its properties and perhaps cultivate larger quantities. The sacred root grows only in one place, White Dove interrupted, her voice carrying the authority of generations of traditional knowledge, the hidden canyon where our ancestors first received the gift of healing from the spirits. It cannot be transplanted or cultivated like common plants, but perhaps there are other ways to honor the spirits while sharing their gifts. Abby felt a spark of recognition as she remembered her grandmother's journals, specifically the detailed notes about emergency treatments that combined rare indigenous medicines with more common herbs to create hybrid remedies that retained effectiveness while requiring smaller quantities of the rarest components. My grandmother wrote about something she called spirit bridges, Abby said, her voice growing stronger with excitement as the pieces fell into place. Ways to extend the power of sacred medicines by combining them with other plants that could carry their healing properties to larger numbers of patients. Storm watched the three healers begin to work together with the natural harmony that he had hoped to see from the beginning, their different backgrounds and training methods complementing, rather than competing with each other, creating something stronger than any of them could achieve alone. Marcus Chen approached the group with his electronic device still in his hand. I can help neutralize Elena's enhancements in patients who are still fighting active infections, he offered, but the process will need to be carefully coordinated with whatever treatments you develop. Timing will be critical to ensure that the safeguards don't interfere with natural healing. Colonel Thornfield found himself in the unprecedented position of coordinating a medical response that involved federal resources, tribal knowledge, and civilian expertise in ways that had never been attempted before. Dr. Webb, I'm prepared to authorize whatever resources you need: military doctors, medical supplies, transportation for patients who need specialized care. The offer of federal support represented a fundamental shift in government policy that went far beyond the immediate medical crisis. Thunderhawk recognized that accepting such cooperation would create precedents that could affect tribal autonomy for generations to come. But the alternative was watching more of his people die from Elena's manufactured plague. Colonel Thornfield, the Comanche chief, said, with the dignity appropriate to a sovereign leader, "If your government truly seeks cooperation rather than conquest, then let this partnership be guided by respect for our ways as well as yours. Let the healing that begins here create understanding that extends beyond medicine." The formal agreement that followed was witnessed by representatives of both peoples and would later become known as the Treaty of Healing Waters, establishing principles of medical cooperation that would influence Indian policy for decades to come. But in the immediate moment, it simply meant that people who had been dying would now have a chance to live. Over the following weeks, the unprecedented alliance between tribal and federal medicine proved its worth in ways that amazed even its most optimistic supporters. The combination of White Dove's sacred root, Abby's hybrid preparations, Dr. Webb's medical expertise, and Marcus's electronic safeguards created a treatment protocol that proved effective against Elena's enhanced pathogens, while respecting the spiritual dimensions of traditional healing. The success of the treatment program led to rapid expansion, as other tribes and settlements requested access to the hybrid medicine that had saved the Comanche camp. Traveling medical teams that included both military doctors and tribal healers began operating throughout the territory, establishing a network of cooperation that had seemed impossible just months earlier. Elena Vasquez was transported to Washington under heavy guard to face federal charges that would likely result in life imprisonment or execution. But her capture and the exposure of her conspiracy had larger implications that rippled through academic and government circles, leading to new oversight of biological research and stricter controls on the weaponization of medical knowledge. 6 months after the confrontation in the Comanche Valley, Abby found herself standing in a newly constructed medical facility that served both the tribal communities and nearby settlements. The building itself was a symbol of the cooperation that had emerged from crisis, incorporating both traditional architectural elements and modern medical requirements. Storm approached her as she watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Their relationship had evolved from desperate alliance to deep friendship built on shared trials and mutual respect. "The elders have asked me to thank you again for bringing healing to our people," he said, "but I think they know that the healing goes deeper than medicine." Abby smiled as she considered how much had changed since that terrible morning when she'd been tied to a platform in Willow Creek, facing death for crimes she had not committed. "My grandmother always said that the best healing happens when people stop seeing each other as enemies and start seeing each other as family." Dr. Webb emerged from the medical facility, carrying his daily patient notes, his hair now completely grey, but his eyes bright with the satisfaction of work that truly mattered. The latest reports from the Territorial Medical Board show infection rates down by 90%. He announced, "Elena's enhanced pathogens have been completely neutralized, and we haven't seen a new case in over a month." The victory over the manufactured plague represented more than just medical success. It had proven that cooperation between different cultures and knowledge systems could achieve what neither could accomplish alone, and it had created relationships that would influence the development of the American West for generations to come. As the three friends watched the last light fade from the Montana sky, they could see the lights of the growing settlement that had sprung up around their medical facility, a community where tribal families and white settlers lived and worked together in ways that would have seemed impossible before the crisis that had brought them all together. Thunderhawk joined them on the porch of the medical facility, his presence a reminder that the cooperation they had built was not just between individuals, but between peoples whose relationship had been transformed by shared struggle and mutual respect. My son tells me that you have received an offer to establish similar facilities in other territories, he said to the group. The territorial governor wants us to create a network of integrated medical centers. Dr. Webb confirmed, combining traditional and modern medicine in ways that serve everyone, regardless of their cultural background. It's an opportunity to spread what we've learned here to places where it could save thousands more lives. Abby considered the offer with the wisdom that had come from surviving trials that would have broken lesser spirits. We've proven that healing transcends cultural boundaries, she said. Now we have the chance to show that the lessons we've learned here can take root anywhere people are willing to work together. Storm's response carried the weight of someone who had seen the power of cooperation to transform seemingly impossible situations. Then let us plant seeds of healing wherever the spirits guide us, he said. Let the alliance that began in crisis become a foundation for peace that our children's children will inherit. The decision to expand their work would lead to the establishment of dozens of integrated medical facilities across the American frontier, creating a network of cooperation that would influence the development of the West and the relationship between native peoples and the federal government for generations to come. But that night, as they watched stars emerge in the darkening sky, they were simply four friends who had faced death together and emerged stronger than any of them could have imagined possible. Years later, when historians studied the transformation of medical practice in the American West, they would mark the confrontation in the Comanche Valley as the moment when two cultures stopped seeing their differences as obstacles and started seeing them as complementary strengths. The woman who had been tied for punishment had become a bridge between worlds, and the Comanche son who had broken her ropes had helped forge an alliance that would heal more than just the wounds of a manufactured plague. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.